Hello, I'm Everett Kelch, and I'd like to do some poems out of my 4 books. And my first poem will be Montana. Let me tell you about a land that's fairer than your dreams, a land of giant mountains and sparkling trout streams. If you ever see it, you won't forget it if you try. This is Montana, the land of the big sky. A land of great prairies where the buffalo used to roam. This is where I was born. It will always be my home. A land of deer and antelope and geese flying high. This is Montana, the land of the big sky. The home of many Indians, for this land their ancestors died, with its great cattle ranches where the cowboys still ride. In the spring its many flowers bloom by the roadside. This is Montana, the land of the big sky. The home of many birds, hear the meadowlark's silvery notes. A land of mountain sheep, also mountain goats. Hear the elk bugle from a mountain high. This is Montana, the land of the big sky. The home of the moose and the great grizzly bear. We must protect these, they're getting mighty rare. Where waterfalls tumble, keeping the rivers from going dry. This is Montana, the land of the big sky. When the moon comes out at night, it's a beautiful sight. You can see the splendor of the hills by its silvery light. Alongside a campfire with stars shining so high. This is Montana, the land of the big sky. The land of many minerals, gold, silver, copper, and zinc. The home of the beaver, the muskrat, the otter, and the mink. The home of the mountain lion, hear his piercing cry. This is Montana, the land of the big sky. A land of many farms and fields of rippling wheat. With the smell of new mown hay, this cannot be beat. And when my life is over, for everyone must die, just bury me in Montana, the land of the big sky. My next poem is a poem my brother wrote, and he died with most of his poems. He didn't have them on paper, but he had some good poems, and mostly humorous. And this poem is called God Bless Those Pork and Beans. You can talk about narrow escapes and dangers you have seen, but let me tell you how my life was spared by a can of pork and beans. I do not like their flavor, now that is one sure bet, but beans once saved my bacon, that's why I'm living yet. One day in midsummer, when the skies were clear and blue, I was going across the mountains to a fishing hole I knew. I didn't take no grub along, I thought I'd travel light, and if I didn't catch no fish, I wouldn't eat a bite. Well, I was rigging up my fishing gear, and there behind my back, the missus grabbed a can of beans and threw 'em in my pack. And after many weary miles, just before the close of day, at last I saw that fishing hole 100 yards away. I was awful hungry, but I didn't give a damn. I could almost smell those fishes a-sizzling in the pan. Those fish just wasn't hungry, though I tried with all my might, with every fly and lure I had, and still they wouldn't bite. I finally threw my fishbowl down and crawled behind a tree, and there I fought mosquitoes until the break of day. Then I thought I'd have another look for a lure that I'd passed by, and there that guldarn can of beans looked me in the eye. I soon had that can open, and I sat upon the ground, and like a hungry wolverine, I gulped the whole works down. Oh, I flipped those flies out neatly, but every cast did fail. Then like an old whipped hound dog, I headed up the trail. Now I never thought that anything could look so guldarn mean. There stood the biggest grizzly bear that I had ever seen. Well, I remembered the old timers and what my pappy'd said. If you ever meet a grizzly bear, just make believe you're dead. I flopped myself upon the ground, and quietly I lay, but I knew that guldarned can of beans would soon give me away. My stomach was a-hurtin', but I didn't dare complain, so I rolled over on my back to try and ease the pain. It was then those beans exploded, why it even shook the trees. That old bear rose up on his hind legs and slowly sniffed the breeze. He had a pained expression as his nose he twirled around, which really gave me courage as I lay there on the ground. Then came the next explosion. There was an awful din. With a little help on my part, those beans went off again. That old bear got down on all fours with a look as if to say, "When I see anything that smells that bad, I'll go the other way. So keep that bean pot boiling and cook them till they're done. I do not like to eat them, but God bless them every one." This is a poem I wrote about my brother Bill. It's called Brother Bill. My brother Bill smelled like a whiskey still as we set out in the search for gold. His face looked bleak, he'd been drunk for a week, and he complained about the cold. Though his stride was slow, he said, "It's there, I know, just over that hill up ahead." We stumbled through the slush and the juniper brush, and at night we'd roll out our bed. We slept on the ground and the rain came down and chilled us clean to the bone. He said he didn't feel too good. I said, "Well, who would? He sure as hell wasn't alone." We dried out our bedrolls and also our clothes, and we headed to where a river twined. All of that day and most of the way, he grieved about the bottle he'd left behind. But we found some color at last in that mountain pass, and once more we took hope. We figured we knew where it came from, too. It was up on that mountain slope. All day we panned, and at night we planned, and Bill dreamed of nuggets as big as plums. He said they were laying there in the riverbed. We gouged them out with our thumbs. He said that dream was so real he could feel 'em still, 'cause both of his thumbs were sore. I asked him where they were, and he said he wasn't sure, but it was in 6 feet of water or more. Well, that water was blame cold, but we were looking for gold, so we dove into the icy drink. It numbed our hands and it numbed our feet, and it was hard for a man to think. We strangled and choked and we gouged and we poked, and then we dried out and tried it some more. We scrambled around up and down till our hands and our feet got sore. I thought I'd have one more look, and I flopped in that brook, and my hand closed over something smooth and round. I tried to shout, but the water wouldn't stay out, and I thought I'd never see dry ground. I handed it to old Bill, who was standing there still, looking kind of dumb. The blame thing was blue a rock, we both knew, but it looked just like a plum. My next poem is called The Hunter. I'd like to tell you a story about this hunter from the east who came out here to shoot an elk, if he ever saw the beast. He had real good hunting clothes, and he had guns galore. He wasn't a real rich man, but neither was he poor. Said he'd never hunted before, but he sure used his brain. On account of the gas shortage, he came out on a train. He'd been 4 days on the road. He'd rode the Amtrak, but he said he guessed he'd go some other way when he went back. A lot of things he had learned that he never knew. They spent half the time in the sidings waiting for the freights to go through. He came into our hunting camp, soaked to the hide. Said he'd like to hunt by himself. He didn't need a guide. One guy thought he'd have some fun, and before anyone could speak, he pointed up at Great Northern Mountain and said they're up there on that peak. Well, now everybody knows Great Northern Mountain is bald as it can be. Up there on the top there isn't even a tree. Well, he climbed all that day, and he was about to drop when he finally reached the summit and realized he was on top. He tried to get a little sleep, but no sleep would come. It was awful cold up there, and he was just plain numb. Next morning, just at daylight, to his great surprise, there stood a big bull elk right before his eyes. He raised his gun and fired, and that elk fell to its knees. It was turning colder, and there was quite a breeze. While dressing out that elk, he warmed his hands inside, and he admired that rack of horns. It gave him great pride. He finally got the elk dressed out. It took an hour at least, and being awful cold, he crawled inside the beast. Well, he soon fell fast asleep, for how long he never knew. When he woke up, that elk had froze up tight, as it was bound to do. Well, what a predicament he was in, that was plain to see. He couldn't raise an arm or he couldn't bend a knee. What in the world was he going to do? He was a goner, sure as sin. He got to thinking of his family and of his other kin. Then he thought of all the bad things he'd done in his short life, of how he'd helped on political campaigns, and it hurt him like a knife. He thought of some of the men he'd helped put in office, and it made his eyes blink. If it hadn't been for that, he'd be there yet, I think. Now, some may not believe this, on who you are it will depend, but that man just shriveled right up and crawled out through the rear end. When I write a poem, no matter how hard I try, it'll usually turn out to be a big lie. So a while back, what I decided to do was to write a poem that was actually true. Now, this happened on a warm summer day to a lady who lives up Columbia Falls way. She was coming shopping over in another town, and she got in her car without looking around. She started up her automobile, and her cat lay sleeping behind the back wheel. She put the car in reverse, felt a thump, and knew the worst. Could have been some kid, but instead there laid her poor kitty stretched out dead. That cat lay limp as an old rag, so she stuffed him in a shopping bag. She put him in the trunk of her car, and then she picked up another lady that didn't live far. They both took a tranquilizer or two, and then they pondered on what next to do. The only logical thing they could think was to take him to the dump before he started to stink. Well, they got to talking as women will, and they forgot all about going to the landfill. They got their groceries at the store and filled their trunk till it would hold no more. By now, both ladies were really beat, so they decided to stop at a restaurant and get something to eat. They were going along shooting the breeze, and they happened to think of the cat in the trunk with the groceries. So they removed the cat and the shopping sack and put him on top of the trunk in the back. They went in the restaurant and got him a booth, and I swear this is the holy truth. A lady who was passing by, on top of the car this sack did spy. She seemed to be a curious dame. She walked a little way, and back she came. She nudged that sack just to see if it was full or if it was empty. Within her curiosity this did stir. There was something in that sack for sure. She looked all around with a gleam in her eye, grabbed the sack, and then the restaurant did fly. She placed the sack down by her feet, and then she too ordered her something to eat. It was only minutes, but it seemed like a week till she got up the courage to take a peek. She opened that sack and gasped for air. Her eyes bugged out, and she could only stare. She dropped the sack, stiffened out in the booth, and I tell you, this is the actual truth. Someone called an ambulance, and when it came, they brought in a stretcher and loaded up the dame. They picked up her purse when it did occur that maybe that sack belonged to her. One lady spoke up with a grin, it must be hers, she carried it in. So they placed the purse and sack upon her breast and hauled her away, and I don't know the rest. But I'll bet one thing, when she came to, she didn't claim that sack, and neither would you. My next poem is Here Comes the Judge. The judge came in the courtroom with a stern look on his face. He said, "Be seated, please, and we'll get on with this case." I was sitting in the jury box, but I didn't like it at all. For one thing, a seat was awful hard, and I had a lot of work to do that fall. He banged with his gavel till he made that desk shake. It was awful hot in there, and it was hard for folks to stay awake. I was trying to figure some way of getting out of there. I figured this trial would be a long, drawn-out affair. He said, "Is there any questions now before we start this case?" I said, "Yes, Your Honor, that man's guilty. I can tell by the smirk upon his face. He also has shifty eyes and a real criminal look. I'd say, Judge, you've got yourself a real professional crook." Well, someone has started to laugh, and is making quite a fuss. And the old judge banged upon his desk and said, "Would you point him out to us?" I said, "He's sitting there in the front row, second from the right." Well, that judge bounded from that chair. I thought he was going to fight. He said, "How stupid can you get?" I thought everybody knew. "That's the district attorney. That's Lawyer Donahue." My next poem is Charles Shane. I was camped that day on an old Indian trail at the headwaters of the Yellowtail. I'd just built a nice warm fire. It was blowing a chilly gale. When down the trail there came this man. He was old and bent and gray. I could see at a single glance he'd walked a long, long way. He finally came up to my fire and warmed his hands over the blaze. They hung from the sleeves of an old coat you could tell was prison-made. His eyes were sunk back in his head. His cheeks were pinched with pain. He had a nasty cough. He didn't have many more days. Then he took from his pack an old book. It was yellowed with age, wrapped in an oilcloth to keep the pages from blowing away. It was a Bible, I could see. It looked 100 years old. And on the inside of the cover, this strange story told. On a farm in Missouri in 1843 was born a boy baby, Christian Charles Shane. Then I remembered the stories I had heard around campfires here and there. Could this be the mighty mountain man once stronger than a bear? He'd came west before the Civil War. At the age of 16, he trapped for furs on the Continental Divide. A great mountain man was he. He lived among the Indians, the mighty Blackfeet tribe. They called him Great Eagle. The Crows called him Tall and Wide. He married a chief's daughter. She was pretty as a flower. Soon he was called to Washington, had to leave within the hour. He left them saying, "I'll be back soon as I can." He never dreamed it would be years till he saw them again. They made him scout for the soldiers, but he sure didn't like their ways. The way they treated the Indians was bad in those days. They killed the Indians' buffalo. They drove them from their lands. Why they had to do these things he could never understand. He took to warning the Indians when the soldiers were on their way, and many an Indian village he saved in his day. Behind the soldiers came the settlers, like swarms of angry bees. They covered the prairies like leaves upon the trees. Now Charlie had an only son, a mighty Indian brave. His name was Little Eagle. He had a lot of Charlie's ways. When they reached the Blackfoot nations, not an Indian was in sight. Someone had warned them in the middle of the night. One night an officer followed him when he left his tent. Straight to a tribal meeting is where Charlie went. They tried him for treason. He got 30 years and a day. And all this time this man had been in the federal penitentiary. As I sat there by that fire, I put on a little more wood. I was thinking how we'd treat the Indians, and my supper didn't taste too good. And here before me sat a man who was coming home to die, and who was I to say but what he was a better man than you or I? Soon up the trail there came a rider. He was all alone. It was Little Eagle, come to take his father home. The old man's eyes lit up, his lips they trembled. I could hardly bear to look, as the teardrops were falling on the pages of that book. Now somewhere on Heart Butte, in an unmarked Indian grave, lies the body of a great man. The man is Charles Shane, Great Eagle. This next poem is called Old Blue. I had an old dog one time. I called him Old Blue. Best doggone hunting dog that I ever knew. He had a mournful face and big sad eyes, and he always followed me around. He didn't like the other guys. Now this was some dog when you put him on a trail. He just wouldn't give up. I never saw him fail. We were hunting mountain lion one time up Star Meadow way. Old Blue had something treed. I could tell the way he bayed. I was following as fast as I could. My snowshoes were sinking deep. We'd been 24 hours on that track without any sleep. I finally climbed the ridge and dropped down in a draw, and in the snag was that mountain lion, the biggest I'd ever saw. Old Blue was trying to climb that snag, and the lion was spitting in his face, and I knew he couldn't hold him there for long, so I quickened my pace. I was almost there. I was taking my gun off my back when the lion left that snag and Old Blue made his attack. The lion drove Old Blue in the snow with a sweep of his mighty paw, and Old Blue was hurt real bad. This I plainly saw. Then him and that lion was tied in a mighty knot, and I didn't want to hurt Old Blue, and I couldn't get off a shot. I finally rushed in with my hunting knife, figuring that was the only way I'd save Old Blue's life. That lion turned on me and drove me down the snow, and Old Blue got between us. How I'll never know. That dog was fighting like a thing that was possessed, and I finally saw my chance and buried my knife in the lion's chest. I finally got a fire going a short ways away, and I went and got Old Blue from where he laid. I rested his poor old head upon my knee, and Old Blue's sad old eyes were looking up at me. I tried to close the deep gashes that were there in his hide. Old Blue wagged his tail and licked my hand, and then the old dog died. This is a poem I wrote about myself called Me Oh My. I have a problem with which I've been trying to cope, but to find the answer I have very little hope. If someone can help me, please feel free. Maybe someone else has a problem just like me. Now this problem goes back to years gone by. I don't know if I can explain it, but at least I will try. When I was younger, I wore a pants about a 30-30 size. Now this has changed a lot, and the prices seem to rise. The size has stayed about the same in the length, but it's in the waistlines where the difference is, or that's what I think. If anyone knows the answer, please give me a clue. They sure don't make pants like they used to. If my memory is correct, I do recall, I never used to wear my pants out in the seat at all. I used to always split my pants out in the seams, or else I wore the blame things out in the knees. But nowadays it's different, I want you to know. It seems it's the rear that's always the first to go. Now this is kind of embarrassing when I go uptown. Don't bother me a blame bit at home, 'cause I'm always sitting down. This poem's called The Sailor. I once knew an Irishman by the name of Mike McGee. He'd spent a lifetime as a sailor upon the high sea. Claimed he's on a sailing ship out of Jamaica down in the Caribbean, headed for Nicaragua when the weather turned real mean. The old ship had floundered the third day out, and that's how come this story came about. He'd grabbed the floating mast as the old ship went down, and he spent a couple of days just drifting around. A porpoise came and swam by his side and acted like it wanted him to climb on and take a ride. He made a bridle for the thing out of his shorts and hoped it would take him to one of the ports. It took him to a little island somewhere in the South Seas, and all that was on it was a few palm trees. There was plenty of clams there, that's how he survived, and I supposed he was telling me the truth, that's what I surmised. He'd caught water every time it rained, and he was doing that one day when he heard this big plane. It was a big transport, one of the U.S. kind, and he hoped they'd get him help. He was sure in a bind. Well, that plane circled around for about a half an hour, and then they opened up the hatch and gave him a money shower. Down out of the sky all those greenbacks came, and there was a note with it saying, "We give all countries about the same." This poem's called The Boozer. This man had been a boozer most all his life, and sitting home all alone he had the sweetest little wife. She'd been a lonely little woman all these years, 'cause he was always in the bar supping up those beers. So she bought her little dog one day and brought him home. He was a lot of company to her when she was all alone. She bought him the best dog food you could buy in a can. She kept it in the refrigerator. It looked a lot like Spam. Well, he come home late one night and was looking for something to eat. Got in the fridge and ate up all the little dog's meat. The next day she went uptown, got the little dog some more, and the next night he come home, done the same thing as before. Well, it wasn't long till that was all the drunken bum would eat, and he started barking and chasing cars on the street. She tried to get him to go to the doctor and see what he could do, but he just barked at her and growled a lot too. So she went to the doctor and told him the trouble that she had. Said he'd never heard of such a thing, but it could be very bad. He suggested she try mixing something else with the dog chow, and maybe in time she'd get him off of it somehow. Well, she tried ground round and a lot of other kinds of meat, but he'd just growl at her and wouldn't even eat. Went on for a couple of months, and she met the doctor one day, and he said, "Say, how's your husband?" "Oh," she says, "he passed away." He said, "I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't think the dog food would do him any harm." She said, "No, he'd got to chasing cars so bad she'd had to put him out on a farm." He'd only been out there a day or two, and she'd got a big surprise. They said he was chasing horses and got kicked between the eyes. This poem's called Tough Turkey. When I was a little kid, I was an ornery little twerp. I used to tease the turkeys after my dad would go to work. We had this one big gobbler. We called him Big Jim. If he'd ever got a hold of me, he'd have tore me limb from limb. I used to go out most every day. Of course, it was just in fun, but I'd give him a few rounds from my BB gun. He'd get so mad his face would just turn blue. Why, he'd attacked anyone, grown-ups too. Now, it was getting close to Thanksgiving, and my mom was in a stew. Aunt Lucy was coming with all her kids. Why, she didn't know what to do. Now, I'll tell you, this news didn't fill me with much joy. Aunt Lucy had a dozen girls and not a single boy. When my dad came home from work that day, he got the word. This year for Thanksgiving, we'd need a mighty big bird. Then she put my dad further out on a limb when she said, "After supper, John, I want you to kill Big Jim." He said, "I'll wait till after dark, and I'll sneak up on those birds." Well, that night I heard a lot of gobbling, and I heard a lot of bad words. But he finally came in with him, and I almost cried. You know, I kind of liked Big Jim. I hated to see him die. He dressed out over 34 pounds, almost 35. Of course, he had about a pound of BBs underneath his hide. The next day, Mom made dressing, and when she had him stuffed enough, she said, "I'll start roasting him early. I'm afraid this bird will be tough." Well, she roasted him one whole day and almost one whole night. You still couldn't stick a fork in him. He was tough, all right. Come time for Thanksgiving dinner, and Dad says, "I'll carve the bird." Why, he couldn't even break the hide, and I heard another bad word. He grabbed a meat cleaver, and at him he flew. I heard BBs flying around, and I think he heard them too. Well, we ate the dressing, and there was a lot of other stuff. Everyone seemed to get full, so I guess we had enough. And that night after supper, when everyone else had gone to bed, my dad took me by the hand, and we went out to the woodshed. This poem is called Cowboy's Prayer. "Oh Lord, my horse just died. I'm burying him here among the trees. He was old and windbroke, and had quite a wheeze. Old Blister was the best blame horse that I ever owned. He was sired by a Morgan. His mom was a strawberry roan. I broke old Blister when he was comin' 3. That's why I have this limp from a twisted knee. I retired this old horse 2 or 3 years back. In the summer he roamed the pastures. In the winter he ate from the stack. Oh, Lord, take care of this old horse. I know you have the room. He may be a little picky, likes his clover just in bloom. He also likes apples and likes to be scratched behind the ear. Excuse me, Lord, while I find my handkerchief and wipe away this tear. I'll wrap him in this horse blanket I found in the saddle shed, and I'll put a forkful of new-mown hay underneath his head. I'll pile some stones upon this mound to keep the coyotes away, and I'll chisel a cross from one stone where it will always stay. Oh, Lord, I hope you hear me. I'm not much for prayer, and it won't be long now till I too will be up there. My old joints are kind of stiff, and I'm getting off my feed. I've been sort of ornery and mean when there was no need. But I'll do better, Lord, at least I will try, 'cause I want to ride old Blister in that range up in the sky.